Besides the hippies, the 1970s were full of political, economical, and cultural issues. Leading into the new decade, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin stepped into the moon's surface for the first time. This was a big step for the U.S., and in the words of Armstrong himself, it was one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Nixon thought it would keep the troubles from the 1960s of entering the new decade. To understand the politics of the 1970s, we need to look at how Nixon got his votes. A group of middle-class people who were non-shouters looked for a way for a social upgrade from the 1960s. Known as the silent majority, Nixon got their votes by promising to restore law and order and to cut back Democratic programs. The troubled economy was the next task for Nixon. With money being spent on the Vietnam War, inflation and unemployment increased. This was known as stagflation. Also, with inflation being at a high, Nixon froze wages, which was a concern for families of low income. Not only was the economy sinking from a recession, the price of oil that the U.S. bought from Arab countries was increased. This caused an energy crisis in 1973. Hardships soared and the economy was at a low. Thus, the signing of a bill authorizing construction of a pipeline to bring oil south from Alaska. Up until the oil spill off the coast of Santa Barbara, California, and the first Earth Day celebration, there wasn't much worry about the environment. These two events led to many organizations who raised and concerned for the environment. The main interest of Richard Nixon was his foreign policy. Along with his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, he expressed belief in real politics. That meant that the national interest, rather than ideals like democracy and human rights, should be the force in American foreign policy. Their policy was an effort of easing tensions of the Cold War. After being re-elected in 1972, Nixon's staff created an enemies list consisting of people who didn't support his policies to make him more powerful. This list was a chance for him to destroy their reputations. He then included plumbers who were former FBI and CIA agents. They were ordered to stop leaks and carry out a variety of illegal actions in the name of national security. These events were known as Watergate. In summary, Watergate was an organized action by Richard Nixon that started with 5 men getting caught breaking into the Watergate offices of the Democratic National Committee. They were recognized and were heard to be funded by Nixon's campaign organization known as CREEP. This investigation involved both judicial and legislative branches of government. Come to find out by a witness, James McCord, Nixon had secret videos evidence. Nixon then released some of the videos and was found guilty of authorizing illegal activities. After thoughts of impeachment, he then resigned on August 8, 1974. With Nixon resigning, Gerald Ford was next in line. He was respected by both parties until he gave Nixon a full pardon. People thought this was a double standard and created great controversy. In the election of 1976, Republican Gerald Ford ran against Democrat Jimmy Carter. Carter promised to never lie like Nixon did and wanted to let everyone know that he was a born-again Christian who wanted to show his religion through his politics. With this being said, Carter was the one who people hoped would be able to reverse the mistrust of government. Carter's style of presidency was different than others previous to him. He took several steps that showed a new approach to government. It was a more open to the public, such as town meetings and radio sessions. Just as the other presidents, Carter wanted to transform the economy. This transformation included a corporate tax cut. This helped reduce unemployment, but also fueled inflation. In order to change this rate of inflation, voluntary wage and price controls were called for, but this produced more unemployment. It seems like the time between Nixon and Carter, everything repeated itself. Another energy crisis caused high cost of oil. To once again reduce the prices, Congress created the Department of Energy in 1977, which then passed the National Energy Act. A few months later, OPEC raised the price of oil 50%, leading to the closing down of gas stations. Carter began his chief foreign policy triumph, which was a Middle East peace accord. He did this in fear of another Egyptian-Israeli war. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Premier Menachem Begin met with Carter at Camp David discussing for 12 days the negotiations of the framework for peace. This was known as the Camp David Accords. Sadat and Begin then shared the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts. The next year, they signed a peace treaty ending 30 years of war between Egypt and Israel. This was not approved by everyone. Carter was accused of favoring the Arabs in order to appease Arab oil exporting nations. Sadat was then furious with making peace with Israel, but was assassinated by an Islamic fundamentalist group. As politics and economy changed, so did the culture of U.S. African Americans were allowed to be in office and gain political experience, thus forming strong alliances and effective lobbies. Just as African Americans were being accepted, Hispanic Americans were also growing. They were appointed to federal jobs. Americans with disabilities were also having their way in the 70s. Laws were being made requiring wheelchair ramps and parking spots. The Rehabilitation Act was passed forbidding discrimination in jobs, education, or housing because of physical disabilities. Elections of more women in office were being made. Colleges were opening their doors to women, and Congress passed the Education Amendments Act, which outlawed sexual discrimination in higher education. Throughout the 1970s, society evolved drastically. With medical advances, people were living longer, but birth rate was slower, which promoted zero population growth, which means the birth rate replaced existing population but didn't increase it. People migrated to the Sun Belt states, south and west. They went there for a better climate and suburban life. Many immigrants also came from Asia and Latin America to the U.S. Congress tried to aid these immigrants by passing the Voting Rights Acts of 1975 and Bilingual Education Act. In the end, the 1970s were years full of their ups and downs. From Nixon to Carter, politics changed, economy changed, as well as culture.